Okay, guys, excuse me. Why don't we get started? Because we're going to work on a case again today. But before we work on the case, I just want to briefly cover professional ethics. And so if you kind of think back to the first few weeks of class, we talked about the generally accepted auditing standards. And a portion of those generally accepted auditing standards dealt with responsibility, right? So those things really, those rules really pertain to characteristics of the auditor. So we've covered things like professional skepticism, we've covered independence, and so another major characteristic that auditors are expected to have, CPAs are expected to have, is, professional ethics. So we're going to talk a bit about, and I posted the case on Blackboard for you to read prior to class, and we're going to work on that, which talks about professional ethics or ethical dilemmas that an auditor could possibly face. And we want to get into some discussion about how you as future auditors, CPAs, would possibly address that kind of a situation. And so we'll talk a bit about professional ethics now, and then we'll break into informal groups like we did last week, kind of discuss you should have read the case already, discuss your approach or solutions to the case, and again, there's no right or wrong answer. Right? So discuss in your groups how you would handle it, and then we'll reconvene as a class and discuss the case together. Okay, so professional ethics obviously is an important part of the professional code of conduct. And basically, right, you could kind of give auditors a guideline or CPAs a guideline in terms of what you would expect of them, what the profession expects of them, and why it's important. So why do you think it's important that we address this from a profession standpoint? Because I'm sure all of us in here, we feel we're ethical. Do you think it's necessary to have professional standards dealing with it, and why? Any thoughts? Why would it be important to address this from a professional standpoint? From the profession standpoint? Because you're all ethical, right? We all think that. Right? No one here would ever cheat on their taxes. Or take a ticket and tear it up, run a red light. What do you think? Why is it important to address this? What's important about a profession? What's important about our profession or the profession you're about to enter? Integrity, right? What else? Why do we even care as auditors? Why would the regulators even care? What's unique about us? Ella? Right, it could impact the decisions of others, right? So basically, people are relying, right, on the auditor's report, for an example, right? So when the auditor issues an opinion about the company's financial statements, or an opinion related to the company's financial statements about whether or not those financial statements are free of material misstatements, that they've been prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, someone's relying on that, right? They're making a decision based on that. And so they have to believe that the person, the auditor who is providing that opinion, has integrity. And we want to address this from the code, a code of professional conduct, because we're all different in terms of our morals, right? We have different upbringings. We come from different cultures, some of us, right? So for the profession is that you should have this minimum level of ethical standards, right? This minimal level that as a profession we adhere to, right? So that there's because how many of you, I don't know if do you have to take philosophy? Have you dealt with ethics, or did you have to take an ethics class in the business school? So are you familiar with that scenario? They always use this as an example, and to talk about ethical dilemmas, or as an example of ethical dilemmas, where there was a man whose wife was gravely ill, and she needed some medicine. They couldn't afford to buy the medicine. It's a classic one, right? And we didn't have the Affordable Care Act, and so he stole the medicine. How many of you would say that this person should go to jail versus this person was justified? He's trying to save his wife's life. right? So, we are in this law and order society, which, stealing we shouldn't do, right? There's that you shouldn't steal. You could go to jail for stealing. It's wrong. But then you have this other situation where this person's her life was at risk, and he wanted to save his wife. So some people would probably sympathize with him and say, we shouldn't send him to jail. He didn't do it out of malice. He didn't do it for, on personal gain. He was trying to sell someone's life. But you can see how if you are a person who has this law and order, you might hate to send him to jail, but you adhere to the law, right? So we would all approach that. It's possible that we might all approach it very differently and have very different opinions about how it should be handled. So it's important for the profession to have this minimum set of standards, this code of professional ethics, to try to navigate our own personal ethical bearings. All right, so when you have an ethical problem, it's basically a situation. You'll hear us, I'll use the term ethical dilemma. I think the textbook uses the term ethical dilemma as well, where there's a problem that exists and you have to make a choice amongst various alternatives. So we saw that again with this classic case. As Jimmy pointed out, this was a classic case. The man and the sick wife who broke the law and stole medicine to save his wife. There are consequences to that. And so we have to think about the consequences. As auditors, it's quite possible you're going to be faced with ethical dilemmas. If you just think about some of the things we talked about when we talked about independence, right? And we talked about independence and appearance is pretty easy. You could regulate that in a way, right? Because you can say that you can't own stock in your clients. If your spouse has a significant financial accounting role with the client, you're not independent. You should not be on that audit. Right? So we could kind of regulate those things and see. But it's the independence in fact, right? That's harder, that independence in mental attitude. And so those are the types of situations truly where auditors might find themselves in an ethical dilemma, right? They've been with a client for a long time, they think the client is a good client, any number of situations that could arise. The client offers you a job, right? You don't tell your partner about it, right? Or the client asks you not to, or anything, or something as simple as the senior comes to you and say, look, we're over budget, and you're taking too long on this. I need you to finish this up, but don't record the time. How many of you consider that an ethical dilemma? Why or why not? Senior comes to you and says, we're over budget. I need you to eat some time. Don't record it. How many think that's an ethical dilemma, or that's just business as usual? Yes. Tell me your name again. Lionel.
I feel like that's an ethical dilemma because even though it's something that may benefit the firm itself, it's not something that you have to kind of look out for yourself first and make sure you're doing the correct thing. Even though you are over budget, you're still doing your job.
Right. Okay. Anybody have an opposing or different opinion? How would it affect, what are the consequences? So Lionel pointed out, you're doing your job, you should get paid for it. So say you present that argument to the senior. The senior's like, you don't get paid for overtime, so it doesn't matter. You're going to get paid anyway. We don't pay you for overtime. Overtime is kind of built into your base salary, so don't worry about it. You're going to get paid the same salary. Senior comes back at you with that. Cody.
It affects the firm's billable hours.
Exactly. Right? It affects the firm's billable hours. The senior comes back and says, forget it. This is a fixed fee client, right? We're only going to get paid X amount of dollars. Then what? Any other consequences of it? Lionel's getting paid. Cody's doesn't have to worry about it because the firm's going to get paid. Victoria.
But the problem comes when you do other similar engagements, only budget, you're going to keep under budgeting because you don't know how long it actually takes.
Right. Okay. So those are all of the consequences, right? And Victoria's absolutely right. You don't know what you're doing by eating those hours, right? You're not truly representing what it costs to complete that job, right? You don't. So the person who comes after you is going to look at this budget. So let's say you were budgeted to perform this work in 15 hours. But in actuality, it took you 25 hours. If you only record 15 hours, and let's just say there were no problems, it's just that the budget was unreasonable, right? Or there's just a lot more work than you anticipated. It's a lot more complicated the area is a lot more complicated than originally thought, right? So if you don't bill that, then the team that comes after you, they're going to be looking at 15 hours to complete something that really takes 25 hours. And actually what's going to happen, more than likely, is the team that comes after you, or the next year when you're auditing that engagement, they're going to say, oh, we know so much more about this now, so we can actually budget that 15 hours that we had, we can budget that down to maybe 12. So now you're expected to complete in 12 hours something that really took 25 hours. And so that's the danger. And all firms will tell you, it's in their mantra, do not eat hours. Be open, honest, and budget and record your hours, right? But then there are always pressures to come in under budget. And so that is something that people run into all the time. And it's not, there are other things as well. So you can run into a situation where, let's say, you're auditing an area and something's off, right? Your professional skepticism is kicked in. You're like, something doesn't seem right here, right? And then you go to your senior and say, the client gave me this information, but I don't know, it doesn't seem right. Senior is like, oh, forget it, it's right, just sign off on it. Do you sign off on it? Why not? Senior has a lot of experience, hot dog, really he's on the partner, on track to make manager early. What do? Do you question yourself? You're the newbie. Would you question yourself? Am I talking to myself? Lionel.
I would make sure, I would kind of triple check my work, make sure I didn't make a mistake because, but if I still see that there's something going on, I would still go, skeptic and go on and try to see what I can do.
Right. Okay, so Lionel would, and I think it's human nature, but all of us would probably double check our work. And you probably double checked your work before you even go to the senior, right? And you're just like, something's not right, and you document why you think it's not right. It doesn't add up, and you try to explain that. If the senior still doesn't buy, would anyone think about going directly to the manager or the partner? Yes, Delphi.
Yeah, I would go further to the manager just to verify and make sure I'm doing the right thing.
Right. And what are the possible consequences of going over the senior after you've already spoken to the senior and the senior doesn't address, you just feel you're not comfortable and you go to the manager? John?
It does affect your relationship with the senior,
Right. The senior might resent you for going over their head, right? This is a person who has to write your evaluation. Ella, were you going to add something to it?
I was just going to say, if I don't feel comfortable with signing something, I wouldn't sign anything on it, and I would go to the manager as well, just to see what they like the manager's point of view.
Right. And that's what you should do. I mean, and the firms, I'm not telling you something that's utopia here. Firms will tell you that. In the past I've had KPMG come in and talk, they have this ethical toolkit, and these are just some of the scenarios that they present from that ethical toolkit. And what the manager who usually comes to present this case says is that you're expected to go, and the firm tries to, to really enforce that attitude in their staff people, in their professionals, that, look, if something's not right, we want to know about it. We don't want you to ever feel that you're signing off on something that you don't agree with. That doesn't seem as if, and it's a learning experience for you as well, right? That maybe the senior is right or the manager is right, but the fact that you're still skeptical, it's good for you to understand why it's right, not just because they said it's right. You need to understand why the answer is the right answer, or how they arrived at that approach. You're there to learn. And so you should always follow through on those types of things. But you have to, as John pointed out, you're going to consider the consequences. And remember when I talked about we talked about professional skepticism last week. One of the things that we said was, the thing that could inhibit someone from acting on their skepticism, because that's important, you have to act on your skepticism. The things that can inhibit someone from acting on their skepticism is the fear of repercussion, right? Or the fear that they're not right, or that they might, no one wants to challenge their senior or manager or, a partner. No one wants to do that. It's not a comfortable position to be in. And so as a result, people, especially people at lower levels, might not act on things that they're skeptical about. They might think, oh, I don't know as much. This person's senior. Okay. So when you're faced with an ethical decision process, the things that you want to do, Lionel pointed out, he would go back and double check his work. Define all the facts and the circumstances, right? Make sure you have a clear case and understanding of the facts and the circumstances. And identify, when we talk about the stakeholders, who's involved, who is going to be impacted by this. If you see something where you think it's a possible, maybe it's fraudulent activity, you're not sure, think about, when we talk about fraud, we'll talk about this in a bit more, but think about the fraud triangle. What are the motivations? What are, incentives, right? What is the how could this possibly happen? Is there, we saw with the professional skepticism case, right? There was a lack of internal controls in certain areas that allowed this person to perpetrate a fraud. So think about the stakeholders, identify who they are. Identify the stakeholders' rights and their obligations, and, in general, is this something that could be, one of the things that was considered in the skepticism case, is this an isolated incident? Does it just involve this one person? Or is this more on a wider scale? Right? Is there possible collusion? So if you're going to this person and identifying the situation, are they the right person? Are they going to act on it? Or are they also involved in that situation? What are your alternatives and your consequences? Okay. When you think about the various situations and facts and circumstances, what happens? What happens if you don't act on your skepticism? What happens if you do? What happens if you go above the senior to the manager or to the partner? What's the repercussions? And you have to weigh what the impact of your decision could be. And then obviously, if you approach it that way, not that it's going to be an easy decision to make, right? Because ethical dilemmas rarely are very easy decisions to make, right? Because if it's an easy decision, you're probably not in an ethical dilemma. Right? Then you choose which is the best alternative and respond to that and what the approach should be. So from the profession standpoint, right, we have ethics, and that's our code, right? We have a code of professional conduct, which defines the rules. And then there's professionalism, which is basically say, how do you expect people to conduct themselves? You're a member of this profession. How are you expected to conduct yourself as you represent the profession? And that's what we have as our ethics and professional code of conduct. Codes of professional conduct. I touched on this already. We all have our own moral center, right? How we're brought up, what cultures we belong to, our religious beliefs. We all have our own moral center, and we're going to all based on that, right? Because that's ingrained in us from the time that we're born, and throughout our life. How we respond to things are probably going to be guided by that own moral center, right? So we can all come at things from a different perspective. But as a profession, you want this minimum code, this minimum expectation of how we expect members of our profession to behave. And so that's the difference between the philosophical sense of ethics and then the professional sense of ethics. Just coming back to the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, we have principles, which are our standards, the rules of conduct, which are your minimum standards of ethical conduct stated as very specific rules, interpretations, and those interpretations are usually issued by the AICPA Division of Professional Ethics. And then we have the ethical rulings, which are publications that explains or addresses answers to questions that might have arisen regarding professional conduct. So again, just basically your code of professional conduct, responsibilities, right? We all have responsibilities to exercise sensitive, professional, and moral judgment, right? So that's, again, thinking. I should not, I sign a confidentiality agreement with my client. I should not trade on that information by, giving my relatives insider information because I know something about my client, right? That's unethical. It's unprofessional and it's unethical. And it's against the law. Public interest, to honor the public trust. Integrity is huge. We talked about it. Doesn't matter if we have a code of professional conduct, we have a code regarding, or standards, rules regarding independence. If the auditor is not, or if the CPA lacks integrity, all of this goes out the window. Right? Rules are not going to be enforceable if someone doesn't have integrity. Objectivity, we know why that's important, that you're independent, you're objective, you're unbiased in your decision and your process. Due care, we see that when we talk about, when we talked about the responsibility of auditors as they're conducting the audit, that the audit be conducted with diligence, competence, and they're thorough in their the audit process, and scope and nature of their services performed, right? So clearly if you're performing an audit of financial statements, right, where you're issuing an opinion on the financial statements, independence is hugely important versus if you're performing a consulting engagement for the client, right? No one else is relying, the client has hired you, to consult on, their new IT controls over their new system. Right? It's just for their own purposes. They're being diligent. Right? You're going to report back to the client. So the client, versus the public is relying on your information, right? More so. So independence becomes even more important because it's this third party versus a consulting engagement that you've been hired to perform for the client. There's no third party relying on that. That's a direct. So independence is not as significant an issue. Talked about that already. Just quickly, obviously when we have rules, there are people who violate those rules, and the AICPA has a trial board where their professional ethics executive committee, and they can bring actions against CPAs who violate the Code of Professional Conduct. They can terminate your AICPA membership or suspend it. Important here is, I just want to back up, the AICPA cannot revoke your license. Your license is issued by whatever state, New York State, New Jersey. Only the state can revoke your license. However, the state is going to monitor these types of things, right? So if you violated, the state will monitor it, and they can revoke your license based on these ethical violations if they deem it significant enough to revoke your license. But the AICPA cannot revoke your license. Only the state that issued your license can revoke your license. The SEC can't revoke your license. The SEC can only say you are not allowed to practice before the SEC. So in other words, any publicly held client, the SEC is basically saying you're not allowed to sign off on that client. So you cannot be a partner on that client or an auditor on that client. Right? But they can't they don't have the power to revoke your license.